All right, I am here with Justin Perkins from Mystery Room Mastering. Thank you for joining me, Justin.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, so you are the proprietor at Mystery Room. You've been on the show before. Why don't you just give us a little background on what you do at Mystery Room and just kind of maybe fill everybody in on the importance of mastering and
Yeah. So like you touched on, I do mastering. So that's the final step. After the song has been mixed, well, let me go the other way. People record the song, produce it, mix it. By the time I get the song, it really is already mixed. All the effects are there. It's basically sounds like the band or artist wants it to sound. And then my goal is to get it over the finish line, make sure that it's going to sound good on all formats and listening environments and things like that. So it's more of an analytical process than say producing and mixing.
okay, and you're just making sure that it sounds like you mentioned, making sure that it sounds good in all the formats when it's played.
Yeah, I mean sometimes a really great mix doesn't really need much of my changes. I don't have to do much to it if it already sounds great. And then other projects, maybe the person mixed it in a studio where they couldn't hear the low end very well and there's too much low end, so sometimes there's little corrections about to kind of compensate for their listening environment and just make sure that there's enough low end or not too much low end and the high end. So I do some creative changes, because ideally, in my room the speakers and listening system is pretty flat and natural, so neutral I should say. So I can usually get a pretty good feel for what needs to happen. If I put it on and it sounds a little too muddy right away, then I can kind of reach for the EQ and clean some of that up or anything like that. So it really just depends how it sounds. But yeah, getting it sounding right on all the formats. Streaming is a big concern now because they normalize the levels by default, basically, except for Apple Music doesn't have that on. But if you install Spotify on your computer or your phone, if you look in the settings, you'll notice that loudness normalization is on, and that is a good or bad thing depending on how you feel about it. But these are things to be consider when you're mastering is, are we beyond the point of Spotify's already going to turn it down? So if your goal is to be super loud on Spotify, we may have already crossed that threshold and now we're just going backwards, kind of working against your goal. So these are all things to be thinking of. And then with vinyl, there's things to consider. I don't cut lacquers for vinyl, but I do prepare the files that the lacquers are cut from. And there's things you do a little bit differently for vinyl than you would for digital or CD. And it's not that I have to master it twice, but at about the 90% mark, I take a left turn for vinyl after it's approved and just make sure that it's something that can be cut well to vinyl and still sound good there.
Very cool. And one of the things I've been noticing here is have been going through local releases. I've seen your name on just most. It seems like most of the local music that's been at least crossing my ears here lately. So it seems like you've been pretty busy, especially on the local side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really lucky that people, choose to work with me. And, there's a lot of great producers and mixers in town, but there isn't a lot of people. I don't know of anyone that's doing mastering full time, exclusively mastering. There's people that mix and master their own stuff, and that's fine. One nice thing about mastering is it's a fresh perspective. Like if you've mixed something in your studio for a couple hours or days or weeks, you're probably going to start to get used to some of the anomalies and maybe things that aren't so perfect about it. Your ears and your brain are just going to learn to accept that, and it'll start to sound good. Whereas when you send it to anybody that hasn't heard it yet, they're going to get that initial fresh perspective of, whoa, this is way too bright, or whoa, the vocals have too much sibilance, or didn't you notice all that background hiss, or anything like that you just kind of lose perspective of. So I think it helps that I'm the only full-time mastering person I know of in the Milwaukee area. So that in itself leads to a lot of people working with me just because I'm the only choice if they want to stay local. But even when I'm working with Milwaukee bands, a lot of times they don't come in. So it's a pretty isolated job. So with everything going on with the virus, I mean, my day to day has changed almost none because no one I was working by myself anyways, and thankfully projects are still coming in. It's a lot more singles than albums right now, but that's fine too. People are coming up with singles at their home studios and whatnot. I'm still not even caught up from before the lockdown. I've still working on some projects that have been lingering. So far so good. But yeah, I'm just really thankful to have such a good relationship, I think, with a lot of bands and artists around the area. It's a place they can come just for that final touch, because a lot of people are sort of mystified by mastering, and it's really not that complicated because I'm working with the stereo mix, right? I can't go in and change the vocal specifically or change the bass drum specifically. I'm working with a stereo mix. It's on a bass level, it's not too much more than you can do with your car stereo EQ. You can turn it up or down. Turn up the bass, it affects all the bass in the mix. That's a really simplified version of it, but mastering is not all that complicated, but it's kind of a level and attention to detail that maybe isn't common in mixing and recording situations. And that's also part of why I mostly work by myself, is because I'm listening really closely. If there's people in the room that are being people and have a Doritos bag that's crunching and telling jokes. I mean, it's not really a group sport or a group activity. It's really by the time I get it, all the effects are dialed in, and it's really more, it borders on that, a little bit of creative, a little analytical, and a little quality control. So you really want to be focused and not distracted by having to entertain people. And I do attended sessions, now and then when it's called for, but I personally feel like I do my best work when I'm, by myself, and then I send it off. And I also prefer that the first time people hear it is in their place where they're used to hearing music, because you come into my studio and it sounds, different than anything you've ever heard, because it's very kind of accurate and flat and neutral, so if people come in here, they may suggest, making it brighter or more bass, but they don't really know what's right in this environment. I'd rather them hear it in their car or their home studio or wherever they usually listen to music and get their first impression there, than coming in here and getting a little confused. But again, there are times when coming in helps, especially, sequencing the songs together if things need to overlap. It can be done via email, but sometimes it's nice to just have people come in at the tail end and finish it off that way.
So do you, when you're working with bands or musicians, do they give you an idea of how they want it to sound when they get it back, or are you just kind of taking it and just putting that final polish?
Yeah, I try to get references of things they like. It helps when I've worked with them before, but especially for new clients, I just say, can you give me 2 or 3 songs or albums that you like the sound of and the loudness of? And I can kind of keep that in mind, because, I can master a song and one person thinks it's too loud and the other person thinks it's not loud enough or bright enough, or, how that goes. So I try to get references of what do people like and what do they have in mind maybe when they mix this. And then also, what's also very common is mix engineers may do their own kind of rough mastering to get it kind of loud and a little more aggressive and a little more hype on it, just to kind of get a feel for what it's going to sound like in the end. Because sometimes mix engineers have a hard time getting their mixes approved if they're not super loud and polished, because now their client is comparing an unmastered mix to a mastered something else, and that's a little bit apples and oranges. So it's kind of a battle sometimes, is understanding that, and trying to not necessarily compete, but not be worse than the mix engineer's rough master. And it's really helpful to know when that exists. Really, when it becomes a problem is when somebody mixes the song with a ton of mastering stuff on it to get the mix approved. Then they turn that off, and the client sends me the stuff with all that turned off. I have no idea what they were used to listening to. It could be So I'm kind of like shooting in the dark there. So it really helps to have any, you know, rough mastered versions that the mix engineer did as a guide as well, because I know what they're used to hearing for loudness. And you know, there's been times where that's been a problem, and it's usually because I just didn't know that the mix engineer had all this stuff on there and then took it off for me to do my thing, which is a nice gesture, but I also need to know what it was and what they're aiming for. So yeah, I do definitely try to get references, and you know, revisions are all part of my process too. You know, I've heard stories of, you know, people sending out for mastering and they get the song back and they don't really get a chance to put in their 2 cents of how they want it to sound, and that's not really how I operate. I definitely am very responsive and open to revisions, because in the end it's their art and their work, and they're going to have to live with it. So usually the first version is what I think sounds good, and we kind of go from there. Sometimes the first version is the one. Sometimes it needs to be a little more of this or that, but usually any revisions are more related to spacing between songs. You know, I feel that out with my judgment, but sometimes it needs to be a little more space between the song or a little less space, and those are all easy changes.
Okay, so does it help for you to work to be brought in when the mixing's done, or mixing's being when they're mixing, just to kind of get a feel for what the person that's mixing the music is doing at that point? Or
Yeah, sometimes, especially with new clients, just to get a feel for, you know, what the project sounds like. And again, there's mix engineers that will kind of get into what I call mastering territory. The mix is already as loud or louder than I would master it, and it's not so much the loudness, but it really bakes in a lot of the sound, and there's really not much I can do with that. It's kind of like cooking or overcooking a pizza and then giving the to someone else and say, can you make me, you know, a perfect pizza? And you can't really go backwards with that. You know what I'm saying? It's a lot of it's already baked in when that happens. So sometimes it's just to prevent that scenario from happening, you know, leaving a little headroom and saving that last, because I can obviously turn it down, but I can't undo the damage of smashing a mix too hard. You know, there's really only so much I can do with that to improve upon. And again, sometimes if it sounds great and it doesn't need much, then it's more of a quality control thing. I scan through and listen for clicks and pops and whatnot, and it's again more of an analytical quality control. But a lot of times, you know, people want me to use some of the analog gear that I have and give it a little kind of energy, and some people have commented that sounds a little more three-dimensional and just a little more finished when I use some of the analog gear instead of just staying in the software. And software is great too, but again, it just depends what the project already sounds like and where it needs to go.
okay, so you've been talking a lot about working with, you know, new mixes and doing mastering on new songs and new albums, but you recently have done a couple of remasters. Does your process change when you're getting something that's been you know, when you're remastering a
A little
project?
bit. I mean, I definitely, you know, I definitely have to reference the original version. I remastered the first Old Dirty Bastard solo album, and that that was a tough one because a few things, but all the songs kind of run together. You know, there's no, I don't, there might not be any, but there's very few times when it's just silence. You know, the songs just segue from one to the other. And I had to really meticulously recreate that so that it sounded like the original. And I also left some weirdness. You know, some of the songs, some of the tracks, because it was a CD originally, kind of transition in a weird spot. You know, the songs overlap, but when you skip to that song, you hear a measure or two of the last song. And I kind of wanted to preserve that quirk of the original album, because that's how he signed off on it, of course. So those can be tricky. You know, I always have to reference the original. And also with that album, you know, a lot of it was done in a home studio setup before he really had a record deal or a budget. So some of the sounds were a little, I mean, it sounds cool, but they're a little lo-fi and a little crunchy, a little rough around the edges. And, you know, when I was working, I had to sort of reference to see, you know, if I heard some distortion, I would have to say, I'd have to double check and make sure I wasn't adding that, you know, and that's okay. That's part of the mix. You know, I'm not, so I had to be really careful. And I also had to be careful not to remove any distortion. That was sort of part of his signature sound of that record. So that was a tough one. But, even I also remastered the first En Vogue album, which is totally different. But, I actually, track down the original CD copy from the exclusive company. Mr. G came through. There's a used copy of it at the Greenfield store. And, I just had to reference that for the sound, but also, again, the spacing between the songs, the pacing of how much time did they leave between these two songs, because that it may seem like a simple concept, but to me that's important. That's at least somewhat notable part of the mastering process is how do the songs flow together. Is there a lot of pause or is there a little bit of pause? I think that stuff can really affect the momentum of an album. So again, I always just reference the original, and then I see if there's anything that can be improved upon. Like that first En Vogue album was mastered, I think 1990. Yeah, I guess it would be because this is the 30th. So it's probably mastered in the late 80s. Technology changed quite a bit, and CDs got progressively louder from the mid 80s to the mid 90s. And I didn't want to go too extreme, but I made it a little louder and tried to cure some of what I call the digititis. The early digital systems just didn't sound so great. And I mean, not that they did anything wrong, but it was captured in early digital quality, which can be a little harsh sounding. So I wanted to sort of warm it up and make it not so sizzly and digital sounding. So
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions is, not only has technology changed, but I think maybe the way that we listen and the way things were recorded. So, people's ears may be a little bit more bass heavy or, want to hear something slightly different out of the mix.
oh, definitely. Yeah. I think our collective taste changes and standards change a little bit. We're listening on bigger and better speakers now for the most part. Even sound bars sound pretty, I bought a sound bar for our TV and it has a subwoofer, and it actually sounds kind of good for just casual music listening in the house. And some of the Bluetooth speakers actually sound pretty bassy. But those are also mono. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, they had to worry about mono compatibility. Does this mix sound okay in mono? And we kind of forgot about that in the 90s because everyone had stereos and CDs, but all these little Bluetooth speakers and even some of our phones and tablets are mono speakers. I know there's some phones that have stereo speakers now, but at least, even the Apple, the HomePod sounds great, really bassy, but it's mono. So we have to be careful of how do things sound in mono again. So it's kind of a coming full circle, but there's a lot of things to factor in with how our tastes and standards evolve.
Yeah, I wouldn't have even thought about that, with phones and with, all of the mobile devices that you'd have to take into consideration a mono output,
Yeah.
a loudspeaker.
Yeah. I think, like I said, phones are starting to have stereo speakers in them, but a lot of them don't, and who knows where it's going. So it's just something to be aware of. And in mastering, I can't really control. That's more of a mixing concern. If you're mixing and you pan things really wide, like the guitars it's pretty common in a rock band to pan double the guitars and pan them really wide. Sounds great in stereo, but in mono, they're going to get pretty quiet usually if you're not. You got to be a little careful and mindful of those kind of things. And I don't have a lot of control in mastering over that, but I try to do what I can to make sure it's not going to get worse and only stay the same or get better.
So one of the other projects you recently have been working on too is a special project, I think, for you, is a live replacements album.
Yeah, Replacements, definitely one of my favorite bands. And it came out last fall. Last fall they remixed the Don't Tell a Soul album kind of to sound a little more natural and timeless, because the original mix sounded pretty 80s and radio, a little too polished for some of their fans. I was born in 81, so I didn't go through the whole album progression of their their first album to their last, but I would imagine as a fan of the Replacements, it was kind of a shock when that album came out. So yeah, they had the original producer remix it to sound a little more timeless, and there was some bonus tracks, but also there was a 2 CD set of a live show recorded at UW Milwaukee in '89, and I was about 8 or 9 years old and didn't live in Milwaukee, so I wasn't there, of course, but got to remaster that too. I don't know if remaster is the right word, because it came out as like a 5 or 6 song promo thing, and but this is the full show. It was very long, and for Record Store Day, which got postponed, they pressed it on vinyl. I have a vinyl copy here for the video feed. So it's a triple LP. Just because it's so long, they couldn't quite cram it on two pieces of vinyl. It had to be 3, so it's quite long, and we'll see. Have you heard when Record Store Day is? I mean, I know that they set a date, but I don't know if that's realistic anymore.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of the dates that I've been hearing where things get rescheduled seem to be maybe tentative in my mind based
Right.
on what the actual situation is. So
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. So that's a Record Store Day exclusive, whenever that may be, and it's going to be interesting because some states are opening up before others, and are they going to wait till all 50 states are open to have Record Store Day? I don't know. So it's kind of a mess for a lot of things, but eventually that will be available. I mean, it's already available digitally on streaming services and in the box set, but they decided to do a special vinyl run for the Record Store Day. I think doing vinyl with the original box set would have made it just a little too pricey. I can't speak for them, but then you're getting, it was in the $70 range, and now if you added a triple LP, that would get up there. So now people have the choice. If they want it on vinyl, they can just get it separately.
yeah, that's a pretty big deal for, I guess, for Record Store Day. That's a nice nice album.
Yeah, I've been listening.
Yeah.
I've been listening to it, but it was a fun one to work on because it was recorded in a cafeteria. I don't know if you are familiar with the venue where it was.
Was up at UWM?
Yeah, I guess there was kind of a cafeteria type hall where they did a lot of shows at that time, and it definitely wasn't designed for rock shows. So they're a pretty loud band, and there's just a lot of feedback problems with the PA system. So I spent quite a lot of time using the magic software tools we have now to remove that feedback. And because when I started mastering it, it was just bothering me. It was getting more amplified and more distracting as I made the master louder. And I was like, okay, I got to do something about this. And I wouldn't want to remove any feedback that was intentional, like from a guitar player or anything like that. But this is just the vocal mic feeding back because they were having PA problems. So I like to think that it makes for a more enjoyable listen for the people. And there's a song where the guitar amp does malfunction. There's some crazy feedback. So of course I left that because that adds to the chaos of the show. But this is just when you're at a show and the PA feeds back and everyone turns around and looks at the sound person. Is that kind of stuff that I didn't think was adding to the show. So I took that out. But that was a solid day of just doing that, just because it's so long. And the software, it's a little bit like Photoshop for audio. I have to listen in real time, then see it and draw it out. It's not necessarily hard, but to do that for a 3-hour show or however long it was, 2 hours, it was quite a process. But that was kind of the time to do it. It was like, okay, if it's ever going to happen, now is the time. So,
right. I think it's really neat that you're able to go back in and then kind of clean up some of, like you said, artifacts that might take away from the listener's experience.
Yeah, I obviously don't want to sanitize it and make it
Right.
not fun to listen to, but again, I left guitar feedback, of course, because they intended that or it's part of the thing, but they certainly, I'm sure, didn't want all that those feedback squeals to happen. So
Right.
maybe it's something that not everyone would notice or care about, but for me, I couldn't not hear it once I started focusing on it. So I had to. And if there's any fans, if you listen to the previous release, there's a song called Another Girl, Another Planet that's been out from that show. There's a lot of feedback squeals on that. The one that's out previously, but if you listen to the new version, I think you'll notice that that's either gone or greatly reduced. So I think it makes for a more pleasant listening experience.
Very cool. And then you also just mastered Field Report's new album, which comes out as we're talking today. This will
Yeah,
air a little bit later, but
yeah, very coincidental. You know, they've been making that album for at least a year, I want to say. You know, a lot of uh, a majority of it has been out released as singles already, and now the album is all those songs. There's some previously unreleased songs and things that people haven't heard yet, so it's not all you know, it's an album now. But it's been cool to see them make that because they actually recorded it down the hall from me with Daniel Holter, a studio called Wire and Vice. So it's kind of cool to see them working on it over the last year. You know, all the things they were trying. You know, sometimes I'd go to the bathroom and there'd be a guy playing saxophone or something crazy, and you don't know how that's going to turn out in the final mix. You know, they're just experimenting, and so you know that's you know I used to record and produce albums, and sometimes I forget about some of the hard work that goes into making an album. You know, because I'm used to getting a finished mix and just pushing it over the finish line, but um, sometimes, like I said, I get a glimpse of that. You know, people figuring out backing vocal parts in the hallway, or trying to figure out a lead part, or writing lyrics. You know, I appreciate getting reminded about all the hard work that goes into it before I, you know, I have a very lucky job. You know, I just get to listen to music in a nice sounding room all day, and you know, it's not very labor intensive. So you know, it's a good reminder of all the hard work. So yeah, I think it's about 8 songs, the album, and one of them hasn't been released. The Bandcamp version has an alternate mix of one of the first song for the fans if anyone wants to hear something unique. But yeah, it's out today, and maybe you guys have played a song from it. I'm not sure.
yeah, I played one of the first singles this morning, which will be last week at this point when we air this. But yeah, no, and it's. I guess have you worked on with Chris in the past?
Yeah, I mastered his last album, Summertime Songs, or I guess their last album would be more correct. So I mastered Summertime Songs, and like I said, I've been mastering these singles. They've been releasing them as singles for the last few months, so I've done all that. And he had like a cassette exclusive thing called, I forget the title of it, June Bugs. And I think they eventually put that online as well. So I've done a lot of odds and ends for Field Report, and I think it just really helps that you know the majority of the recording happens right down the hallway, so it's just kind of convenient to come down here and master it and do those final touches. Especially with the album, there was some sequencing things for sure. You know, there's one song that fades into the next one, and it's just, and sometimes in mastering too, it is pretty analytical, but sometimes you don't quite know till you hear it, and that's where being in the studio together helps, because you can say, nope, that's it, or that's it. It's not always so easy to just type it all out in an email, although that happens a lot. But so
Right.
yeah, happy to be working with those guys.
Excellent. Well, thank you for chatting with us this morning, Justin. You are available at Mystery Room Mastering, and I think one of the cool things about your site is, or I should say, mysteryroommastering.com. And one of the cool things is you've also written a number of articles about just not just mastering, but I think the kind of the recording industry in general.
Yeah, you know, I like to try to inform people. You know, I find that if I'm typing the same email more than a few times, I should make it into an article that people can just search for and find. You know, whether it's what files do I need to release this format, or how does this or that work. So I try to be, you know, I think that just helps everybody, and helps people prepare for the process and prepare for getting their product released. Because you know, with vinyl, it's very tricky to get great sounding vinyl. With CDs, you get them made, and they come back and they work or they don't work. Usually the quality difference is in the packaging, but with vinyl, a lot can happen after it leaves my hands. You know, it can go great or it can sound pretty bad. So I try to be proactive and make sure that if people are going to spend the money to press vinyl, that it's going to come back sounding great. So I just like to get people thinking about that ahead of time.
All right. Well, yes, absolutely. And yeah, so I think, that knowledge exchange and just the ability to kind of get a little bit deeper feel for not just the like I said, not just the mastering process, but a little bit more onto that in the recording process is really great that you share that on
Right.
your site. So thanks for taking some time and chatting with us about your end of the recording process, the mastering process, and just recording in general. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for all that you guys do and for continuing to do it. However you're pulling it off remotely and staying safe. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.